One of the things that I think of in terms of what's changed in the board-superintendent working relationship is that boards now seem to be more hyper-partisan than they used to be. It is the case in Colorado that boards are not identified by their political party, but we're seeing a growing trend of slates of candidates or individual candidates who run on a party platform and to plug into the party apparatus to support their election. And what I worry about in terms of the superintendent working relationship is that it used to be built on what's best for kids. You know, what's the bottom line that's good for the schools and for the district in the area. And unfortunately what I'm seeing is this partisan dynamic is creating new divisions, new allies, new enemies, and it creates conversations about political platforms and not as much about the real, true local dynamics in a school district. So that's something that I've seen it change recently, and it seems as if both political parties are seeing some opportunity in growing their leadership ranks by really getting involved more heavily in local races, and that also means more money in local races. And that can be a good thing for visibility. I think sometimes board elections fly under the radar for a lot of people, but it can also be hyper-divisive in terms of the rhetoric that comes out of it and in terms of the connection to platforms that aren't necessarily locally based. Speaking of that, I see some other issues that are kind of emerging, and there's this stress in the system about what's local and what's national. And what I see is a couple of things. You know, testing in the Common Core has created some flashpoints in terms of what people think should be happening in schools. Choice and vouchers has been a divisive issue for a long time, but it seems to be becoming more so. And what I'm seeing is there's also kind of a post-partisan dynamic around some of these issues that certain boards are getting involved in the issues, and they're calling themselves reformers, but they're coming at it from very different vantages. And that does create an interesting working relationship with the superintendent of schools. I think it also begs the question, what is reform? What is it that we think really makes schools tick? And the idea of an expert practitioner in a school who would be a superintendent who's gone and studied educational leadership, often carries an EdD or a PhD with them, and connecting that to the needs of the community is what's most important. And what I worry is that these politics and that these talking points that creep into the conversation sometimes erode the way that relationship can work. Bottom line, sometimes I'm hearing that, do we need local boards at all when we see this shift to state and federal control over some of the main issues that school boards used to think about? And I believe that school boards are not an artifact, that we must have school boards that relate local viewpoints and involve citizens and parents in the system in ways that really can make a positive difference.
I'm so glad to hear that, Bruce, because I've been asking myself and talking to NSBA and executive directors from around the country that very question: where will boards be in 10 or 15 years from now? A lot depends on what boards do and their relationships with their superintendents. For instance, we certainly see very often boards that are not as fully cognizant as they should be about the newest trends in education, even what the new laws are very often. And we certainly try at our association to work on this and to help them learn about it. But one of the superintendents in my state, Connecticut, said to me about 2 weeks ago, while I was still pondering, as I am, this question of where we'll be in a few years, is that boards have to come to trust the superintendent enough so that the superintendent becomes not only the instructional leader for the board, for the district itself, but also for the board, and help them through some of these difficult issues. If we are talking about what threatens or erodes the working relationship, included would be minimizing the board. We've seen that, where boards are expected to just go along. They're not given enough information from their superintendents sometimes, and not asked to make the big decisions. There's a lack of vision sometimes and goals. There's changing expectations, especially if you had big board turnover or quick board turnover. And sometimes when these expectations sort of come up because the superintendent before had not worked well with the board, and now people are reacting to that, and there are even fewer people who trust the superintendent. We've seen a lot of other reasons for the superintendent and board relationship becoming more difficult, and that is one reason is increased accountability. Everybody's looking at test scores. Everybody's trying to figure out what's the best thing for their district. With resources minimal as far as any increases, certainly in many states we've seen that this is even more difficult to make real progress. Superintendents are seen as a lightning rod for concerns over testing and curriculum. Board members become certainly part of the problem if they're not trying to, or at least perceived as part of the problem if they're not changing things. So there's increasing pressure, increasing focus of the community, other levels of government, and certainly taxpayers. Well, I think among the key characteristics of really good superintendents is that they engender trust as soon as they walk in the building. Person is a straight shooter, knows how to speak what's on their mind, willing to disagree without being disagreeable, and certainly being seen as someone who lends not just an ability to manage, but a real ability to lead. Superintendents who are like this certainly have more than just your average knowledge of what's going on in education, but have certainly a curiosity about how to make things better. They scour the internet, they go to meetings, they're involved with their peers as well as other groups for all the ideas that they can get and bring home that can help the district and the students move forward and achieve higher student achievement or growth. These board-savvy superintendents also provide good communications, keep the board up to date, make it so that if a board member doesn't understand something, they're not afraid to ask a question, and the superintendent is just as eager to make sure the person understands what's going on. Because part of a superintendent's role is really to help the board make good decisions and to play a real key part in this progress of the board. Now, we always talk about at our association that boards exist to connect the will of the community with the education of their children. And it's certainly true that if a superintendent really wants to have a good working relationship with the board, he or she will talk to board members about their strengths and weaknesses and try to find ways in which to help them do an even better job to represent the community.
I think Bob makes some great points about this relationship and how board-savvy superintendents can really build a solid foundation. One of the things that I've always thought of as kind of a ground rule for this relationship is that the superintendent should try his or her level best to create a scenario where there's not going to be any big surprises, that there's a really open, transparent relationship, and that the board members get their news in a timely way from the superintendent in a way that is articulate, concise, and that that can help develop trust. If the board is getting their information from many other places, including reading it for the first time on the front page of the newspaper, that's never a good idea. I think board development is a really key aspect of what superintendents can do to make sure the very, very best individuals are thinking about themselves as potential board members. And there's a couple of districts in Colorado that do a great job at this. One is St. Vrain School District, where they actually have a leadership development component that the superintendent helps organize, and it plugs the community into the school district for a period of a year, learning about every aspect of the operation and the educational aspect of school districts, so that by the time a person emerges as a Board of Education candidate, they really have some special skills to go with them. I think in a nutshell, it's being clear about the locus of decision-making before decisions are made, being highly organized, transparent, and fair. Bottom line, it's really important to treat all board members equally so that not one board member feels as if they're left out. I think setting up expectations prior to doing the work is key. If you have to fly the plane and make plans for how to build it simultaneously, it's going to fall apart right on takeoff. And I think sometimes boards and superintendents find themselves in stressful situations, and you hopefully have decided some protocols on how to navigate that before you get there. I think protocols for how board members interact with staff is absolutely critical. Can one board member make requests to staff, or does it require a majority vote or consensus? Does the superintendent need to be the intermediary for the board as they move down below the line into the organization? I think it's really important to have agreements on that. I also think just something simple like setting the agenda for the Board of Education meeting, having a really clear, agreed-upon process for how that works is important. Public education is a very difficult and complex area, and unless you're immersed in the day-to-day minutia of how things really work, it's hard to keep complete tabs on all the moving parts. In a past job, I used to have to educate new reporters on the mechanics of, for example, school finance, which is very complicated in almost every state. And I think that we need to make sure that superintendents take the time to not only inform and educate, but to set up structures for mentoring, for orientation, for how information can flow. And also, I think it's critical to have connections with the state associations. You need to have a broader context for doing the work, or it can get pretty provincial and, down to the tensile strength of toilet paper, or the depth of concrete sidewalks and those kinds of things that should not necessarily be board decision-making. I think another flashpoint for potential conflict is when something happens like a crisis situation or a focus of the media glare on a school district, who speaks on those issues? You should have a protocol for how that works. And if a board member does speak to the media, the other board members have an understanding about if this individual is speaking only for themselves or for the entire board. If someone pens an op-ed piece, who are they representing in doing that? I think there's got to be great clarity about that. When it comes to advocacy, there are different structures for how to set that up. If you have a lobbyist or a legislative liaison in your school district, who does that person work for? Do they work for the board or for the superintendent? That can also be a difficult situation to decide in terms of legal services as well. So bottom line, I think deciding some of these things in advance, really going through and practicing some things, almost like a role play scenario before you get into the thick of it, is important.
And I believe these interaction guidelines, just like Bruce said, are very, very important. For instance, he mentioned the idea of who has an ability to go below staff, or who goes to the superintendent and asks for permission to speak perhaps to a staff member. And certainly in some districts that's really necessary. In some districts it's not necessary, but there's a past practice of doing it. And I think a lot of these issues we're talking about today are all about school board culture. And when I mean school board culture, I'm also talking about the important role of the superintendent. We have a district not far from here. As you may know, in Connecticut, all board members run pretty much on party lines, except there is one district called Berlin, and in that district, there are no party lines. So people are elected independently, just as it was in New York when I was living in that state. But what that board has really done, and done very well, is develop a culture of high expectations for board members as well as the superintendent, and they're encapsulated in a document on the board itself. And one of my colleagues has spoken all around the country speaking about this idea of developing a culture. And part of the culture is we are professional, we will dress well the night of the board meeting, we understand we're on TV, we will deal with each other, not only the board, with each other board member, but also with the superintendent and staff, with civility, and we will not try to, we will all see that we are all working towards the same goal, and that is just what Bruce mentioned at the beginning, for the good of the children. So in order to have good guidelines, you have to think about it, put it in your policy manuals, but they also have to be carried out. For instance, one that I've seen board superintendents get in trouble with is perhaps having a policy that says when any board member asks something of the superintendent, any information, that they get it not only to that board member, but to all board members. So everybody starts with the same amount of information. And this is really crucial because if you're at a board meeting and the superintendent has not provided some of the members of the board, even though they may be hostile to whatever idea the superintendent is bringing up, there becomes a whole question of, well, you're only communicating with some of us, and some of us get information first, and then there's a question of favorites. And that doesn't work well for anybody. Very often it is the board chair working with the superintendent who has to make this all work. Well, one of the things I have learned about over my years doing this kind of work was based on a book called Leading Leaders by a professor named Salacuse. And he talked about why people serve on corporate boards. And the same reasons exist to some extent for school boards. In other words, people are independent, they made a decision to run, they don't have to run. And what he said for leaders, leading boards like that, whether they be, he didn't mention superintendents or board chairs or board presidents, but the idea still holds a lot of value to me, and I know to our members because we talk about this all the time, and that is when a person comes on the board, it's up to the leader to find out in a manner not at a board table, but maybe going out for a cup of coffee or having lunch together, learning why are they on the board? What is the real reason? What's driving them? Very often we find we have former teachers on our boards. We have parents whose children may have a disability. All kinds of reasons. Somebody interested in the gifted and talented program that had to be cut years ago, so they want to run for the board. When a leader sits down with people away from the board table, they learn about them and what makes them tick and what's their family all about and what do they care about. And a good leader is able to take the, 5, 7, 9 or more members of the board and find a way to help the board move forward on some of those issues that are important to them. Does it mean reinstating a program that was cut? That's possible. Does it mean at least speaking about some of those issues and acknowledging them, that's possible. That gives a board member a sense of, well, I've accomplished something here. I think what board members want is to leave a good legacy. And part of it is knowing that they've helped accomplish something great. I would tell superintendents not only to do what I just mentioned as far as sitting down with them, but encourage them to go and do things, maybe become involved with the state or national association or a regional or a local association, go to local events such as the Chamber of Commerce or even within the district, such as the football games and so on. And generally, unless there's a very hot political topic, people appreciate the voluntary nature of what board members do. And I would also say, call on them for their expertise. Doesn't mean you have to take every single little bit of advice they offer, but if they have a special expertise in communications or accounting, or maybe they've been a teacher before, at least make sure they're heard. One of the best things I ever learned from my wife is sometimes she just wants to be heard, and what I learned from that is that's how most people feel. And by the way, my wife is a teacher.
Bob, I think you did a great job with that question, and it makes me think of two words. And one word is culture. How do you establish a culture that really creates not only the educational issues, but also the human dimension of this job? And you've really hit that. And the other is vision. How do you get a board that buys into a vision? And the only way to do that is to really understand the underlying human nature of what motivates people to get on a board, what motivates people to make decisions and volunteer their time. You know, one superintendent I know has regular retreats with his board, which is a pretty common thing. But in addition to having a retreat, he goes to a place that has an open kitchen where board members can cook meals for each other before they get into the issues. And that simple act of cooking and sharing, setting a table and breaking bread together gets us all kind of on this human level that creates an avenue to making better decisions. This same superintendent also has an annual holiday party at his house, but he doesn't just invite the current board members. He invites all of the prior board members who he can find. And what it does is it establishes some of those traditions and that culture that you're a part of something. You're a part of something that's bigger than you. It was here before you got here. It'll be here long after you go through this. And I think that is something that's really critical. As a former communications director for a school district, I think often it's providing the right tools for board members, too, so they can be comfortable sharing specifics when they're out in public, when they're at the Rotary meeting or in front of a PTA or a civic group. And one of the things that I've tried to do is have a meeting in a box that would have PowerPoint, handouts, talking points, information, review this with the board member before they go out and represent the school district and the board and give them the tools that they need to be successful. So I think having some fun, connecting the board meetings to the actual students that are in classes always brings joy to this work. And however a district can structure a board meeting so that they have that student voice both on the academic and the arts side of things, I think brings us back to why this is such important and meaningful work.